Let's say you're walking down the street and you happen to glance down an alleyway and you see a famous person. You can think of whomever you'd like, a famous person in a very compromising situation. And you know that if you get a photograph of this, you can probably, or possibly anyway, make a lot of money by selling the photograph. And depending on who this person is and how important the person is, what the person is doing, perhaps even change the course of world events. However, alleyways are notoriously difficult in terms of exposing properly. They often have bright highlights and deep shadows, and the camera, or the light meter in the camera, cannot expose properly for every tonal range. If it exposes correctly for highlights, then the shadows will be too dark. If it exposes correctly for the shadows, then the highlights will be too dark. So you know that if you can't see who is in your photograph, it's not really worth anything. The person in this compromising situation has to be identifiable. So one thing that photographers can do, is something called bracketing. And bracketing is making 3 exposures of the same subject at 3 different, allowing the light in differently. So 3 images of the same thing at 3 different exposures. Normally you'll do 1 stop in either direction. Some people will do 2 stops in either direction. Less than 1 stop is probably not worth it. You don't see enough of a difference. But if you take a look at these examples here, the first images of the cat show 5 different exposures. And so this first one here is at a 0, what's called a 0 EV, or 0 exposure value. And so in this image, I did what the light meter told me was appropriate. And so you can see it's fairly well exposed. The highlights are a bit too bright here on the bricks, and some of the shadows are a little dark. They're doing what's called blocking up, so you're losing the detail in the shadow areas. This image here says 2 EV, so that's overexposed by 2 stops. And you can see that it's just way too bright. Obviously the highlights are completely blasted out, but even the shadows are really pretty light. Only in this darkest area, now you can see some detail there, but in the rest of the image, the cat in particular, even the darkest areas are now a little bit too bright. So this image is a +1, and I think that the shadows look really good there, overexposed by 1 stop. The highlights are way too bright. You know, they also have blocked up, but in this case they're too bright. You can no longer see the details in the bright areas. So back to this one is the normal, and now this next one is a -1. So it's underexposed by 1 stop. The shadows are way too dark. The midtones look okay, right? And the highlights are now brought way down, except for these extremely bright highlights here on the wood and the trowel. Everything else looks really good in the bright areas, but the shadows are a bit too dark now. And at a -2, you can hardly see the shadow areas. They're so underexposed. And even the bright areas are a little bit too dark, again with the exception of these extremely bright areas that really are so bright there is no detail at this exposure. Now if I underexpose by another 2 stops where everything else went black, then this area might look okay, but maybe it's not worth it, just exposing for this tiny area, because you're sacrificing the rest of the image. So I want to talk about what we do technically. I guess I should show you these images too, sorry. So this image is underexposed by 2 stops. This image is exposed properly, and this next image is overexposed by 2 stops. So obviously the overexposure is too bright across the board. The normal exposure looks pretty good, except that the sky is really, really pretty bright. The underexposure looks great with the sky, but everything else is a little too dark. So we have to make choices. Often, though not always, the middle one will be the best. It will be the compromise. Sometimes that won't be the case. Sometimes you'll want to go with one of the others for various reasons. And there's something that you can do that we'll probably go over later on called high dynamic range, or HDL. And that is photographing the same thing exactly at these different exposures and then taking them into Photoshop or Lightroom, or some cameras will do this for you, and sandwiching them together, that is, putting them all together. And then you will have detail throughout the tonal range. The overexposed image will give you detail in the shadow areas. The underexposed image will give you detail in the highlight areas. And then the image, the in-between image, will give you the midtones. So, bracketing is something you do to ensure that your image is properly exposed. There are certain lighting situations in which your light meter may be fooled, and the camera can only make one exposure at a time, generally using the meter reading provided by the light meter built into the camera. If there is a great difference between the highlight and the shadow areas, which is called high contrast, the camera can only expose correctly for one of these, either the highlights or the shadows. When you bracket, you shoot 3 frames of the same situation using 3 different exposures. The first image is exposed according to the light meter reading, the second is overexposed relative to the meter reading, and the third is underexposed relative to the meter reading. The hope is that one of these images will be the correct exposure. So, with the equivalent exposures, I gave you as an example a 60th of a second at f8 as a possible combination of numbers that in my made-up situation the light meter said was correct. And when we did equivalent exposures, we then compensated for a change in the shutter speed by changing the size of the aperture as well, so that overall our exposures would be the same. In this case, we're not going to do that. We're not going to use equivalent exposures. We're going to purposely over and underexpose. So if we look over here to the right, we'll call a 60th of a second at f8 n for normal. And then if we change the shutter speed from a faster to a slower shutter speed, so from a 60th of a second to a 30th of a second, we're overexposing by 1 stop. And so in this case, we'll keep the aperture the same at f8. And so this combination here, a 30th of a second at f8, will overexpose by 1 stop. So we'll call that a +1. When we change the shutter speed from a slower to a faster shutter speed, we underexpose. So when we change the shutter speed from a 60th of a second to 1/125th of a second, we're underexposing by 1 stop. And by keeping the aperture the same at f8, we don't compensate for the change in the shutter speed, so this is a -1. So these are our 3 exposures, normal, +1, and -1. You don't have to keep the aperture constant. You can keep the shutter speed constant. So in overall terms, it doesn't matter how you change the amount of light, just that you do change the amount of light. So if we again start at a 60th of a second at f8, we'll keep the shutter speed at a 60th of a second. So again, that is normal. But in order to overexpose and do a +1 exposure, we change the aperture from f8 to f5.6. So again, the smaller the f-stop number, the larger the aperture and the more light it allows in. So f5.6 lets in 1 stop more light than f8. It lets in twice as much light. So that's a +1. For the -1, we change the aperture from f8 to f11, which is 1 stop smaller, and it lets in 1 stop less light, or half as much light, and so that is a -1. So in overall terms, it doesn't matter which you change, the aperture or the shutter speed. How do you change it? You need to be either in the manual setting, so that you can adjust the shutter speed or the aperture. Because if you're in one of the priority modes, the camera generally won't allow you to expose incorrectly unless you use the exposure compensation dial. So that's this + button, and when you hold it in on the camera, it allows you to change the setting. Normally you'll want it set at 0. But it allows you to overexpose or underexpose in 1/3 stop increments. So to overexpose, you'd set it to +1, take the photograph. To underexpose, you'd set it to -1 and take the photograph. Some cameras also have a bracketing selection or setting, and this will allow you to decide what the parameters are: half a stop, 1/3 of a stop, 1 stop, 2 stops, and so on. And then when you're in that setting and you release the shutter, either you have to release it 3 times, or some cameras will release it 3 times for you at these different exposures. So you have 3 ways of bracketing. So again, in the manual mode of your camera, which allows you to set both the aperture and the shutter speed yourself, or by being in one of the priority modes and using the exposure compensation dial, or by using the bracketing settings in your camera, assuming your camera has them. So in this way, hopefully, you can ensure that your image will be properly exposed, at least in one of those 3 images, and you can make a fortune and change the course of world events. All right.